The panel is probably less about globalization and much more about state responses and state capacity in response to global forces. Rather than seeing globalization as an ineluctable force that is constrictive and constraining on the choices and preferences of states and domestic policy actors, the speakers this morning have been invited to consider the ways in which states and state actors can be proactive about global forces and regional dynamics. So rather than treating globalization in a defeatist way, an approach is to consider it in a more proactive manner of considering the relationship between globalization and policymaking, to consider first how states and state actors act domestically and outwardly, to develop policy strategies that actually shape the pace, the course, the timing, and the effects of globalization. And secondly, the different kinds of innovative policy tools and practices and institutions that have been embraced at domestic levels of policy making, whether that be at the city and local level, as well as at the national level, which work to reconfigure the structure and capacities of the state, and also the relationship of states with other global and regional actors. So this panel will be considering the ways in which to reinvent the state. And our speakers were given a number of different questions, such as, and the speakers will be addressing these questions in different measure and with different emphases, but they were asked to consider how the emergence of global governance architectures are building new capacities at the domestic level, or not building new capacities at the domestic level, and whether or not reinvented state capacity or the deployment of new policy tools has been legitimated at home or at the global scale. Looking inside the state, to what degree has global engagement become a regular feature of the daily work of policymakers and administrators? In other words, to what extent is there preparedness in national administrations in terms of interacting with regional, global, or transnational actors and processes? And then finally, coming to a question about the politics of global governance architectures and state-based responses and policy-making capacities, what are the politics of these strategies in the populist nationalist zeitgeist, the kinds of questions that are being asked today with the rise of populist and nationalist actors that resist many features of globalization.
Globalization is perhaps not as obvious as one thinks, globalization of the economy. I think that's why, particularly, I think the sort of theories that we develop within public policy analysis can be useful for getting a grip on this. As you've seen from my introduction, I'm a constructivist. I declare that up front. I'm also an institutionalist. I think these two theories are compatible. Indeed, you need both, in my view. And so just to start things off, what do I mean when I talk about state capacity? I think we'll all talk about that in different ways. It seems to me that here we do need an institutionalist definition in the sense that what we're talking about when we talk about state capacity is surely the resources, the material, relational, or symbolic, that have been accumulated over time by public authorities to try and orientate society and the economy, and to orientate it how? Generally through institutions defined sociologically as stabilized rules, norms, and conventions. So my overall argument from there is more constructivist in the sense that this capacity for the state to have these resources, to intervene, to structure the economy. This capacity is either accumulated or lost, one could argue, around three dimensions of what I call political work, which either reproduce institutions, change them, or perhaps destroy them over time. The framing of public policy, so a classical concept and set of questions from policy analysis, policy instrument making, even more central to this conference, I think, and also legitimation, and that's perhaps where we get to what Diane has flagged as the politics of policy. Now, how do I go about looking at this when I'm doing my work on the economy? Well, essentially, I come in at the meso level of industries. I'll be talking to you about, as you can see from my photos, about things that I've done recently. I didn't take these photos, but they reflect some of the things I've been working on. I've been working on the pharmaceutical industry, the wine industry, and the weapons industry, military aircraft. All industries which, to some extent, have been globalized. Perhaps the wine industry being the most obvious case. One is always saying that change in the wine industry is because of globalization. But in fact, again, when one looks closer, and here this is where an industry scale perspective is important, we actually see that globalization may be a result, but it may not be the most significant result. In fact, the result may be, for example, the construction of a European Union policy, which has more effects than the actual removal of barriers to markets, even in the wine industry, I would argue. So from there, as Diane suggested, a very useful research question is to ask, well, how have actors used the globalization, as a construction, as an argument, as a resource for trying to get policy change that they wanted to have anyway? And we'll see in a moment when we talk about wine a little bit more deeply, that there has been a real neoliberal agenda to change the policies that structure the wine industry in Europe, where globalization has been used as an argument, but it is not actually the real cause of the change, of the institutional change. Second point, very obviously, it's very obvious to anyone living in Europe that one cannot just look at state capacity as something that is a national scale phenomena. One also needs to look at the European scale and also the global scale. And I would say consequently, more than ever, because this question of scale is so contentious, that we need non-determinist concepts, analytical frameworks, and research methods. So now, from there, I'm going to go on and try and answer briefly some of the questions that Diane has set out for us. And the first one, the main point I'm making in this slide is that one needs to separate out the degree of policy change from change in state capacity. And I will focus more on the far right of this slide, the question of new state expertise. But what one really needs to understand is, in the three industries that I've been studying, is that there has been considerable institutional change in the wine and the military aircraft industries in Europe in any case, whereas the pharmaceutical industries is much more a case of status quo, of continuity. But in all cases, one should, of course, be asking the question, well, what's the state doing about this, or what is the public authorities doing about this? And I just give you some examples from these industries of how state capacity, state expertise has shifted, and not in a way that is completely neutral. For example, in the case of wine, a lot of the expertise that is now used by public authorities in Europe is taken from marketing, is taken from biochemistry, and is taken from econometrics. And this has been partly what has been driving the institutional change in the case of the policies that concern wine. We have shifted on the whole from supporting the producer to encouraging, to forcing, in a sense, the producer to make the wine that we think the consumer would want. Previously it was the other way around. And these experts have been very much in the forefront of this shift. In the case of pharmaceuticals, where there has been change, and I'll come to that in a minute, particularly in the UK, a lot of this has been around medico-economic expertise about how you evaluate the worth of a medicine, not simply its therapeutic worth, but what it costs for the health service, whether this is sustainable for health services. And this whole world of health technology assessment, HTA, is something that has been backed by certain states, much more than others, much more by the British state than by the French state, for example, has been backed by the European Union. And again, it's something that's challenging the way that one has gone about pharmaceutical policy in the past. And finally, in the case of military aircraft, one often thinks of the defense industries as extremely conservative, extremely slow-moving. But again, there has been quite rapid change in the expertise used within this sector. There has been agentification and increased use of legal and economic expertise to change the way that military aircraft are acquired, are procured, but also the massive costs that are linked to their upkeep, to their upgrading, which in fact is generally twice what the aircraft costs initially. So just in a word, in all these cases, the global has been used as a resource to bring about change in state capacity, but also in policies. But in all three cases, the global has not been the main agent of change or even the result of change. How has state capacity been legitimated? To get to the politics of this from Diane's definition, I think. Well, we see that what's interesting is that often this state capacity is legitimated in different ways at different scales. For example, in the case of wine, the policymakers have been saying it's all about satisfying the new consumer. They suppose that the consumer is a very new one, very different from the traditional drinker of wine in different countries, different cultures, and so forth. Whereas in the case of pharmaceuticals, it's still the same old message. We need to have high prices for pharmaceuticals, so companies like Sanofi and GlaxoSmithKline can make massive profits for their shareholders, because this is how we get innovation in pharmaceuticals. This idea is contested by many, but it's clearly the dominant rhetorical device with which the domination of this industry is maintained. Whereas where there has been more change is in the military aircraft area, where one talks much more about bringing in the methods and the resources of the private sector in order to shake up this sector, particularly in the UK. What I really want to underline here is that, again, throughout the global has been invoked to produce changes at national and European scales, and this message does seem to have resonance for a lot of people involved in policy making, for the people who come from the sort of social classes that are involved. But as we see on the next slide, this does not mean that these sort of messages have a lot of meaning for people beyond the policy-making class, if I may say. So actually what one sees, and the reason I've repeated often what the message is to the general public, is that this message is seen as not specific to cultures. It's supposed to be a sort of universal message. There's that you just need to improve quality, you need to improve access to drugs, reduce costs, increase capabilities. This sort of message is something that may mean something to the certain middle and upper classes who, for whom that perhaps they have the capital, the resources with which to decipher the complexity of modern public policy. But this is not a message that speaks to an audience beyond that swathe of the population. And I think therein lies part of the reason why there is this big disconnect, at least in Europe, between the more highly educated classes, those who engage indirectly in the policy process, and those for whom who see this as something that's going on without them in a language that they can find it difficult to decipher. And I think this is a theme that obviously we'll come back to during this panel and no doubt throughout the conference. But I think it's really a key to understanding phenomena like Brexit, where you see that the elites have really, they've reaped what they've sown in the sense of the way they've gone about public policy over the last 20 years. Now, all this doesn't mean that nothing has been going on in terms of how states have been adapting to this. We've been asked to talk about preparedness, and you see a young man there who was clearly very prepared for a lot of things. States have been certainly trying to adapt to what they see as the global. But what do I see when I look at my industries and at different scales? Well, I actually see quite moderate, on the whole, quite moderate capacity to change the way that one, for example, develops one's expertise, the one way one goes about making policy in each of the industries. The only real exception is in the UK, where you see, I think, a more autonomous state, a state that has become more autonomous from a lot of vested interests, at least within pharmaceuticals and military aircraft. Part of this is because it's been driven, as you know, the UK is famous for its resolutely neoliberal shift in general policy direction over the last 20 to 30 years. But I think what should also be highlighted is that this shift has also meant a distancing from neo-corporatist arrangements, which tended to mean that the state was not necessarily very agile in the past. It's not necessarily a good thing that the UK state has become so agile, so prepared for the global. That's for other people to decide whether that's a good or a bad thing. But what is very striking to me, who goes back and forwards between France and the UK, is that the French state continues to be dominated by vested interests, by interest groups, by vested interests within the state. And this is one of the reasons why it finds itself so hard. It finds it so hard to adapt to a shifting international environment, and where, in terms of agility at least, it seems to me that the UK civil service is perhaps more suited to this environment. A final point really on the EU, I won't go into this, but really it's a scale of public authority where the capacity to change its administrative structures is hamstrung by the states, the member states, who don't want the Commission, the European Commission, to get any bigger, who don't want it to have more powers, of course, and really they have their hands tied. So any adaptation to the global environment has to be done at the expense of something else, and it's a very difficult situation indeed. So I'm going to conclude in two ways by underlining that I think when one looks at state capacity empirically, one really does, at least economically speaking, an industry by industry approach is extremely illuminating. I think this is where a lot of the action is, and through comparing across industries, we can learn a lot about how states are preparing for the current environment. Obviously, we need to talk about international regions, and we will do a lot during this conference to produce data about these regions, not just the EU, I would underline. And perhaps really ask the question about global regulators. I know we have some representatives of global regulators here, but why do they have so little governing capacity? Really, even if one looks at the WTO, for example, this is not a strong government, doesn't have strong governing capacity by any means. And I'll finish just reiterating that I think there is a need, obviously one needs to be pluralist, but there is a need for a constructivist and institutionalist approach to this question, because there's nothing automatic about industries globalizing their productive systems or their government. It all depends on how actors define the public problem, set instruments as regards this problem, and legitimate that by creating a discourse about globalization. So just to conclude, I've often been asked by skeptics, by positivists such as Fritz Schaft, what's the point of a constructivist approach? Well, the point is, apart from generating new data, is that it focuses, when one looks at institutions, it focuses on how they are built from a very non-fatalistic angle, and showing that things could have been otherwise in the past, and they still could be. So that's the point.
I'm going to focus on the last question that Diane posed to us, which is the politics of global governance architectures and state-based policy-making capacities. And what I want to say follows on, in some ways, quite naturally from what Andy was talking about, because I'm going to be talking about expertise. But I'm also going to be emphasizing that I think there is another way in which we can think about these questions, which is by thinking about the local. And Diane's already alluded to that. So I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, but I think we'll start with some relatively familiar terrain. Now, I think as Andy's presentations are amply demonstrated, even though institutions and global actors and global forces may be seeking to push change in a particular direction, any project is necessarily incomplete and always dynamic. And as a consequence, it means that you can have multiple, sometimes unintended consequences from the same action. And that makes it fascinating if you're a political sociologist like I am, but it also makes it quite challenging to make totalizing claims, as some of my colleagues in the urban affairs realm tend to do about globalization. So I'm very much in the school of thinking about the importance of context and the way in which context, political, cultural, social, defray or even defy the supposed homogeneity of globalization. Capacity exists and is exerted in many places and spaces, including but beyond the nation state, which is where I want to come to the local. But principally, politics continues to shape what is possible locally and therefore globally, and agents continue to be influential, and Andy, I think, has demonstrated that beautifully. I want to talk, though, about the prevailing populist nationalist zeitgeist that Diane challenged us with, because arguably that's simply one expression of this more complex, context-based narrative. And it certainly reasserted the importance of politics over technocracy. But it's also returned our attention to questions that we thought solved, or at least managed out of debate. And so to that extent, the new populist zeitgeist, if we can call it that, has some positive openings for us, as well as some things that perhaps we need to be worried about. But in so doing, it again highlights the incompleteness of any political project and the necessary inconsistencies thrown up in its execution. And so for public policy analysts, this is hugely challenging. You know, we seek and we delight in frameworks and certainties and putting boundaries around things. Policy actors and political processes, of course, don't conform. But these are not just political questions. They matter enormously to how we make, execute, and indeed teach good public policy. So they're important things for us to examine. So I want to now illustrate my argument with reference to something we all feel we have an affinity with, I think, and which is at the heart of populist disquiet with existing systems of governance, and Andy's already alluded to it, and that's expertise. So while President Trump may be the ultimate expression of resistance to expertise in the current global policy-making environment, the summation of this resistance was summed up for me by Michael Gove, who was then a UK minister during the Brexit campaign, when he told the media that we've had enough of experts. Shocking stuff, and heretical to an audience of informed and educated policy scholars. But the specific expertise that Gove was rejecting was that of economists, who failed to predict the global financial crisis. Moreover, this particular rejection of expertise was also a rejection of those elites who shaped economic policy globally, but did not bear the consequences. It drew attention to the distance felt between citizens and global institutions. Now, the picture is, of course, more nuanced than that. The global financial crisis revealed the continuing importance of nation-states and economists as architects of policies to protect citizens. As I direct a school full of economists, it's important for me to make that clear. But it also emphasized the interdependency of different places and spaces of governance. The nation-state needed to respond, but it could only respond within a somewhat agreed global framework. But it is also the case, and I think we all have to face up to this, that experts are self-referential and can arrive at decisions that may be technically sound, but are also deeply divisive. often because of the composition of the group of experts itself, which may be rather narrow. By this, I mean people who are from the same social group, may share the same gender or ethnicity, may have been educated in the same places, and to all intents and purposes, look and think exactly alike. In the field in which I work, collaboration, the most consistent challenge that collaborators face in dealing with interdependent policy issues is that they find themselves having to work with people who don't look like them, or share their expertise or background, and working in institutions that are themselves hybrids. Now, this makes policy making harder, but arguably better. So one important question for us to consider is the question of diversity and equity in policy making at all levels. Whose expertise counts? The populist zeitgeist has amplified this as an issue, but we should not view it necessarily as a means of effectively addressing the question. Broadening out on the issue of whose expertise counts takes us into a broader discussion of what my colleague Sarah Bice and I have called public policy in flux. In a commentary published in the journal Governance in 2014, and in a soon-to-be published edited collection that a number of people in this room have contributed to, Public Policy in the Asian Century, we argued that public policy as a field needs to attend to three key issues. Firstly, the largely taken for granted Western constructs that underpin contemporary studies must be re-examined and perhaps even redefined. And in practical terms, this requires acknowledgement of a widespread but perhaps unconscious bias towards Western values and policy approaches. And the Lee Kuan Yew School, I think, has been a leader in the field of pushing us to think differently about what we mean by public policy and how we understand how it's shaped, made, and implemented. Secondly, we need to think differently about the content of public policy and how we are informed. The idea of the materialization of global challenges that we are all preoccupied with diffuses the borders and expands the boundaries that must be addressed by public policy. And so our scholarship must in turn be more capacious and less parochial, more interdisciplinary, more comparative work, more insights from other fields which somehow became separated from public policy analysis and consigned into other areas. Some people have responded to this by talking about a need for a call for a global public administration. That has its merits. But whatever we do, we need to think rather more broadly and challenge ourselves in perhaps the ways we're not used to. And this brings us to the third point that we make about public policy in flux and how we need to deal with it, which is about the field of policy studies itself and how practitioners conduct public policy and administration. There are people in this room who are studying the changing face of the public service and the public servant, and the kinds of skills and competencies that are needed to affect change in the 21st century. Here too, the dominance of Anglo, Western cultural, social, economic and political systems means that limited attention has been paid to promoting a systemic knowledge of our capability to meaningfully engage with nations that don't have those traditions, don't look like the textbooks suggest they should, and somehow have resolutely managed not to conform with the way in which we think public policy should be done. So for us, the questions about how we think about capability, wherever it is, need to be questions that are also about what are our norms, what are our values, and where do we get our knowledge from. The third issue I want to raise quickly is something that was prompted by a conversation I had with Brian Head last night, which is the one of, if we are in a post-truth era, if we are, to all of us that hold that public policy and social science is not certain, the answer to any question is, it depends. That becomes a real challenge. How do we avoid simply being lumped in with people who have no respect for any kind of truth, are not interested in thinking about the merits or not of a particular body of evidence? So how do we, while recognizing that there is no such thing as the truth, continue to inform, engage, and debate? So in 2011, I wrote an article called Truth Junkies, in which I complained about the dominance of the evidence-based policy movement and its preoccupation with this thing called truth. In it, I drew on Christopher Hood and Jackson's work on administrative argument, and I think what they suggest and what we experience, as opposed to necessarily what we might look to find, still holds great potential for us. How do we weigh up a preoccupation with technical evidence against the reality of the need to engage in argument and acceptance in public policy? And we somehow have found ourselves in a situation where those two things have become completely divorced from each other, and they need to be brought back together. So for me then, to conclude, how do we deal with the challenges of interdependence, hybridity and diversity in a populist era? Clearly global institutions aren't going away, and the nation state has proved pretty resilient. But the key ingredient I think we should be paying attention to is urbanization, and the key focus for me is cities. Now, why is this? Well, most of the world's population lives in urban areas, and we know that the rate of increase in population and the proportion of people living in cities is set to continue. The UN estimates that by 2050, 66% of the world's population will be living in urban areas. That's an additional 2.5 billion people, with close to 90% of the increase concentrated in Asia and Africa. These countries are now going to face extraordinary challenges of growing populations: housing, infrastructure, transportation, energy and employment, as well as things like education and healthcare. Now, these are all things that tend to be done at a much more local level than the debates about globalization would have us imagine. And this isn't just about megacities, this is about many cities. Cities of all sizes are growing. And so we need to pay attention to cities, and we need to pay attention to the way in which cities can help us understand the challenges that we face in public policy making and analysis. And cities are both, I would argue, major sources of the problems that we face, major sources of pollution, but also major spaces in which we can make change, major possibilities for innovation. So it makes sense to act there. The characters of cities themselves, they have diverse populations. There's close contact between people, which means negotiation has to happen all the time. Inequity is experienced on a daily basis, and it's harder to ignore. So cities are an appropriate place in which you feel the consequences of policy change, as well as places in which you can enact and see the consequences of policy change. And cities are, of course, also places where technocrats and politicians have to work together. You need strategic expertise, you need great technical expertise, but you also need to be apprised of the politics of a particular situation. You need to be able to engage with people, to have the argument and to have the debate. So for me, where we need to be focusing our attention is on the capacity of cities, because cities are doing this for themselves anyway. Cities responded when President Trump declared that he was going to move out of the Paris Treaty. It was cities that responded. Cities are themselves sources of political engagement and civic enterprise. And cities are incredibly well networked. There are numerous networks of cities all over the world in which mayors and others come together to debate and discuss appropriate policy action. I suggest that we pay more attention to that and less attention to some of the perhaps more appealing, bigger questions in order to help us understand how we should be doing public policy in the 21st century.
What I'm going to be talking about is basically the new governance architectures at global level. So basically, the contents of my presentation are going to be based on three areas. First of all, I would like to comment on Diane's questions and try to focus on the main one, what I believe is actually the most important one: how to create this kind of the proactive understanding of the state in the globalization context. And the way I see it, the way of answering all these questions is looking at the multi-level direction, a multi-level interaction between the state level and the globalized organizational that are happening there. So what I'm proposing here is that there are new global governance architectures that are different from the conventional global governance architectures. And I will exactly explain those novelties in a minute. Once we have defined that, then the next issue will be to look at what are the conditions for transformative change that those new global governance architectures offer. And we will look at the state capacity as being the mediator factors that actually allowed that transformative change to happen. So basically, these are going to be the kind of the contents of my presentation. So, first of all, if we look at the global governance architectures, the conventional, the traditional, the kind of old global governance architectures are defined as overarching systems of public and private institutions that are active in a specific area of world politics. So they are, governance architectures are something in between the broad global order and the more specific international regimes. So the architectures are something in between those two, either the very broad level or the very concrete level. So governance architectures are actually a kind of an umbrella that get different items together, but different public and private institutions together. Typically, these architectures have been operating in context of based on international treaties, international organizational activities, and so in a more traditional way. What I'm proposing here is to look at that there's a new generation of global governance architectures that are actually basically shaped in different ways. And then basically what are these kind of new global governance architectures, and then looking at the state capacities as mediating factors. So now what we have here is new governance architectures are basically emerging since around the year 2000. And they are emerging in three different ways, three different characteristics that define them. First of all, they are addressing very strategic, long-term problems. They look at this kind of strategic notion understood basically as the kind of reason of being of the engaged public and private actors, so raison d'être of those actors. But they are basically strategic as well because they directly aim at addressing the grand social challenges. So they are looking directly into the eyes of those challenges and becoming a very kind of strategic, providing a very clear vision. What do we want to do? What do we want to achieve? The second feature that characterizes these new global governance architectures is that they are output-oriented. It is not only about finding some procedures or legal kind of regulatory frameworks. No, it's about achieving some specific goals. And to do that is about setting some very clear quantitative targets about how to reach that. This is actually a novelty that is not in the previous ways of global architectures. And I think that that is actually a very important kind of feature of these new global architectures. And third, last but not least, they are also implemented through a new ways and combinations of old and new organizational structures. New types of monitoring processes, new types of interaction that is actually proceed and foreseen. It's not something that is just happening, but is actually monitored in a way that is actually shaped towards a specific end. So here we have some kind of mutual learning, mutual learning procedures and procedures for actually engaging into a kind of conversation about how to reach those goals. These, I believe, are three very important characteristics and three very important features that define the different way in which globalization actually takes place, the different way in which the state is actually actively engaged into shaping those kind of global governance architectures. But at the same time, the state is the one that is actually going to be implementing that. So here comes the kind of, the other level. So we can actually have a look at how are these new global governance architectures going to produce what they expect to produce, this kind of transformative change. It's not change for the sake of change, it's the change for the sake of being able to produce some expected outcomes that are politically negotiated. But also they are, of course, they can be contested along the way, but they aim at generating transformation in society, transformation in the economy, transformation also in the world of politics. So how is this actually going to happen? And that's the main question. So then the thing is, we need to look at state capacity not as something static, not as something given, but as something that is changing and dynamic. And we need to look at this with at least three factors, I would argue. The first factor that I believe is actually essential for understanding the way in which the state capacity can mediate or provide some mediating factors to achieve those transforming change is to look at what the economists talk about, the knowledge absorptive capacities. Now, the economists around the 1990s, they developed a theory focused on how to explain that some kind of organizations are better suited than others to make the most of knowledge from the outside. Companies are normally all the time focusing on how to innovate, how to change, how to produce new products. And how come that we have some firms that are better at doing that than others? So the way in which they look at that is to say that there is a trade-off or exchange of knowledge between the internal in the organization and external to that organization. So what they say is the ability of a specific organization to be able to make the most of external knowledge that is out there depends definitely or directly from the internal knowledge capacities that that organization has. So when you have a certain level of internal capacity, of knowledge capacity, then you're able to actually appropriate better the new knowledge that is outside, that is being generated outside your own organization. But that link is not linear. It actually has an inverted U curve, meaning that at a certain point when you have more and more internal knowledge, you will be able to appropriate better kind of your external knowledge. But at a certain point, the whole story cracks and it goes down. So you become too dependent on external knowledge. So the tricky thing is to find that balance between having sufficient internal sources of knowledge that allow you to appropriate better from the external sources, but not getting far too dependent on those external sources either. So basically what they're telling us is that absorptive capacity is something that is actually that you need to reach a specific level, but too much or too little might not do it. So, and that actually also links back to these issues of expertise, right? I mean, I think that, and just getting back to some of the comments from Helen earlier, it is actually the fact that it might be so that there are some politicians or populist politicians that are actually promising to deliver, promising to solve problems, but they promise to do it without using expertise and without using evidence. That, I think, is going to be very difficult to achieve, basically because we know from these kind of theories about this absorptive capacity. The next factor, the next mediating factor that I think is actually very important here is the more kind of organizational capabilities. And here is actually to do not only with the state as state public policy capacity, it's also about the kind of the much broader notion of who is doing actually state capacity. And here reverts also to private for-profit and private not-for-profit organizations, the kind of more civil society. It is actually about the capacity that these different type of actors have on their own, but also to interact with each other at state level. You know, we need, you know, it's also referred to what Andy said about this kind of corporatism, you know, that happened in some specific, you know, industrial areas. Well, that is actually happening in some specific areas in some countries, that there's actually a mobilization, not only from the kind of, you know, the traditional kind of corporatist actors, but also a new ways of collaboration and new ways of organizational capacity in that regard. And then, last but not least, the next issue is about legitimacy. The kind of legitimacy at the state and national and local level, and legitimacy understood as a communicative capacity. You know, when we are thinking about these new global governance architectures that have so very strong and powerful targets, strong and powerful strategic goals, strong and powerful ways of going through new combinations of actions, this can only happen at state level if there is a way of conveying a kind of vision that is perceived to be legitimate and perceived to be fair and just for the broadest sense of the population. So it's not about kind of, you know, the elites setting up some kind of, you know, far out kind of, you know, targets, but it's about reaching out and engaging with the real needs of the society as ways of communicative devices for making that kind of engagement to happen. So this is actually a very important third kind of dimension. Well, this is very demanding. This is actually very demanding. You know, if we think about state capacities as being mediating factors, we see that the state, you know, we need kind of very strong levels of state capacity to make real this kind of new global governance architectures. And it is actually what is actually happening. In that regard, what we see is sometimes these kind of capacities are mobilized, you know, are able to kind of be mobilized in different types of resources and different types of actors. And it's not only happening at the state level, but also cutting across different countries. You know, one of the things that is actually quite interesting, and I will be talking in another session during this conference, is about what is going on at global health, and in particular, the kind of, you know, very interesting partnerships that are kind of, you know, mushrooming and being created around some specific diseases like malaria or tuberculosis or AIDS. So sometimes those kind of capacities are can be concentrated in some countries. Sometimes those capacities can be perhaps, you know, kind of spread around in different kind of, you know, networks that have this partnership at global level. But nonetheless, the local dimension is actually where it becomes very essential. So, you know, this is actually what I wanted to talk to you about, and also understanding that whose capacities is not only about the state or the public actors, but essentially the interaction between, you know, civil society, private not-for-profit and for-profit organizations that actually are the ones who have the resources that can be mobilized through this engagement. So, thank you very much.
What I'm going to say is in part based on a paper that will come out as a chapter in one of Diane's forthcoming books, a chapter that I wrote together with Professor Jos Raadschelders of Ohio State University, and focuses on civil servants as actors in a globalized context. Now, before I go into the substance of the presentation, of course, I also have an interest from a personal perspective in capacity building of civil servants to act globally. As a civil servant working for the World Bank, we depend as much as on ourselves on the capacity of our partners at national level in the development of policies around global public goods and the implementation of our programs. So building capacity at state level is critical for us to be able to produce our contribution to policy solutions at the global level. Looking at the issue that I'm going to talk about today, the level of interaction and the scope of interaction between national officials and global organizations has been growing over the last decades. Susanna already referred to new global governance arrangements and new global governance networks. The role and position of international organizations has equally grown as global challenges are increasingly recognized as needing global solutions. The three elements of global interaction that I'll be covering today are the following. First, we're talking a little bit about the global joint response to global challenges like climate, security, population, and trade. The substance of these interactions between national administrations and global organizations has been the subject of a lot of debate. However, the role of national officials in providing and defining those solutions and how to equip them for that has been much less researched. It's almost a blank sheet, as we discovered when we did the research for the chapter that we did for Diane's forthcoming publication. At the same time, there's much more activity and much more knowledge on regional integration and the role of national officials in regional integration frameworks. This is of course driven by European Union scholars and the studies of European integration, but also by scholars that study other regional integration networks like ASEAN, Mercosur, and others. In this area, there is a much more fundamental understanding of what it takes to be effective as a national administration in a regional integration framework. Then finally, a very interesting and important element of international engagement for national officials is their engagement with international organizations like ourselves, the World Bank, or other IFIs, or regional banks like the ADB that's also represented here. Especially for lower and middle income countries, that form of engagement has become very fundamental as dialogue between international organizations and national administrations has developed from kind of a one-way street of influence to a two-way street of partnership and mutual influence. In that element of global engagement of civil servants, there was previously mostly anecdotal and non-evidence-based knowledge on what it takes and how civil servants engage with international organizations. This has changed recently with major research having come out of Williamsburg based a data network that has documented the form and quality of these interactions by survey material that was based on 126 countries and how these engage with global actors like the World Bank, the IMF, regional development banks, and national actors. So my presentation will focus on each of these three forms of engagement and the role of civil servants in that context. So, as I said, globalization and its impact is expressed by significant research on globalization on national policies, and Andy already spoke about that. But there's very little research on globalization and policymakers and how globalization impacts on national officials and how these national officials can be better equipped to deal with globalization. This is a puzzling contrast because much of the papers that we see presented at conferences such as this focus on substance and content, not on those that create the substance and content. The impact of these global connections and interdependence has generated a wide body of research on influencing and being influenced. This is focused around joint work on policy solutions for global challenges, as I already mentioned, around issues of security, climate, population, trade, etc., around functional integration, sharing sovereignty in frameworks like the EU and others, and about pooling global knowledge and interchanges between global, regional, and national actors. The primacy of nation-states may remain and may be reinforced by current tendencies, but joint policy design at the same time is a growing feature of policy making all the same. What do we know about the role of civil servants and the impact on civil servants of these engagements? In fact, we know relatively little, as we found out when we did the research for the chapter. Most academic research continues to focus on substance. Some work has been done on socialization and the shaping of institutions, in particular in the EU context. Recent research has focused on the impact of the economic crisis on civil servants' employment conditions, but there's still very little empirical work on civil servants as actors and subjects of globalization, and the skills that are needed to be effective in that context. Why is there limited attention to this human factor and the impact on civil servants as actors? First of all, research agendas on civil service systems remain profoundly nationally oriented, with some attention for comparative analysis. It's the role of networks such as this one, I think, that can help create more attention for this important subject that remains very much under-researched. Survey work to determine the way national civil servants act globally is costly and complicated, though it can be done. Hopkins did evidence-based research on US civil servants as long back as 1976, and the A-Data Consortium work recently shows that important knowledge and evidence-based knowledge on this interaction can be generated. Traditionally, the exception has been niche research on work on civil service in EU member states and their interaction with EU institutions. And this is an area where we know much more about how civil servants act internationally and how they're influenced by the frameworks they're part of. The EU agenda, in fact, has been broadened from a narrow focus on issues of secondment and the role of national officials in that framework to a broader focus on system socialization that has come about with recent enlargement, and new evidence-based research on that work on the interaction between national officials and IFIs by the A-Data Consortium has also added to a growing knowledge base. Let me first repeat what I've said about national systems as a focus of analysis. There have been no further significant efforts to catalogue international engagement of officials in major countries after the Hopkins work on the US in 1976. We didn't find in our research any further evidence-based and qualitative and quantitative research that really gets to the bottom of how civil servants interact globally and how national civil servants play their role in that respect. This is in contrast with much more developed research on the internationalization of private sector management elites that has been well documented and has been a much more relevant focus of work than the work on civil servants. This remains, therefore, an area of research that, in the context of engagements such as this one, could be much further developed. European Union countries remain outliers in the context of this type of research work. As in other areas, the main focus on multi-level governance and what drives multi-level governance has been driven by policy substance, not so much the impact on civil servants. Yet there is an important body of research on secondment and the impact of secondment on national official careers and on socialization, driven by EU membership requirements around public administration capacity. In terms of secondment, this is the easiest tool to help national officials gain skills in a globalized context. However, if one considers the evidence on secondment that's based on qualitative research, secondment remains generally a one-way street. Transfer of knowledge and experience from the national to the supranational happens, but there's no usage by national administrations of new competences by the sending administration. This applies to EU institutions as well as to other secondment arrangements in IFIs, and very often officials that go on secondment at an international level return frustrated by the fact that their knowledge that they gain by working in international organizations or international frameworks is not being used and applied nationally. Why national administrations that stand a lot to gain from using the new capacities and abilities of their civil servants that have worked at the international level do not use that knowledge remains an open question and is something that could be debated further. When we look at the next element, and socialization, and the changing of national systems to international engagement, we found a new form of permeating national systems through soft requirements, which are EU-focused and specific to Central and East European states that joined the EU more recently. These come in the form of administrative criteria for membership, twinning arrangements, and joint training programs. However, research conducted after 10 years of membership of Central and East European states show that there's greater exposure to national officials through these supranational engagement, but limited systemic impacts. In fact, national administrations that joined the EU in the last 10-15 years have not changed fundamentally as a result of their EU engagement. And this again has shown a surprising resilience of national systems against the kind of influence by international engagement and interaction. Finally then, on engagement with IFIs and development partners, which is a new frontier in research, where we've seen an evolution from a one-way street of engagement between influence exerted by international organizations on national administrations to new partnerships and two-way engagements between IFIs and national administrations. This is done through direct interaction and the kind of knowledge exchange that Susanna also talked about. Until recently, our understanding on the form of this engagement was mostly anecdotal, but two large-scale studies that were done in 2015 have documented how this interaction takes place and how national officials perceive that. Conclusion of this research that spanned 126 countries has shown that frequency of interaction between international organizations and national administrations varies strongly, and that national officials in particular value networking, permanency, and country contextual understanding when shown by international organizations. And that this defines, in fact, the choice of partners by national administrations when it comes to influencing and being influenced. Also, international benchmarking by international organizations is significantly impacting on national policy choices ranging from education to business climate and other areas. These findings largely confirm perceived trends in the evolution of international organizations and IFIs. National administration partnerships for these organizations have become increasingly important in their ability to be effective in delivering their programs. That brings me to my conclusions on capacity and skills. Globalization significantly impacts national officials, but it has brought very limited change to civil service systems and the training and education of national civil servants. The skills that are a premium for successful international engagement, like negotiation capacity, alliance building, and multicultural management, that have permeated private sector elites and private sector organizations, tend to be underdeveloped in civil service systems. Investing in such capacities will help states to influence others and get the best out of their engagement with international organizations. However, such investment has been rare and few and far between so far. This defines an important agenda for research and capacity going forward. There's a significant contrast between the global engagement that's growing and continued national orientation of public administration system, and this risks states missing opportunities. Public administration research remains largely silent on international engagement on national officials, even if anecdotally and empirically this engagement has grown in significance. Better understanding the dynamics of this engagement and the role of national officials is a critical research agenda going forward. And skill building and what it takes to have success is a central part of such international, global, effective engagement. I hope, therefore, that the kind of discussion that we will have at this conference will help drive more interest and more engagement regarding the building of capacity and the analysis of what it takes for national officials to play a more active and fundamental role in shaping international agendas. Thank you.
David Foreman, I'm not a policy person. I'm actually a clinician working as a doctor, so from a different research background. I'm struck by the wide array of theories. I'm very conscious that there's now an enormous amount of data collected. I'm wondering whether it's possible to identify data sets that would enable people to conclude which out of these various competing theories and approaches were best supported by the data, enabling us to make data selections between these positions.
Behind your question is a very valid point. Every theory should be backed up by data, and I think you'll find that during this conference that you'll see a lot of colleagues using different theories, and most of us, we produce data in different ways. And of course, this data should be as solid as possible and should be tested. And when we publish in peer reviews, it certainly is examined very closely. But ultimately, I'm not sure I can answer your question directly. What I would say is that really we produce data. It depends on the questions that you raise. Our theories do raise different questions. And these questions relate to our ontology, that is how we think the world works. So basically, if you disagree with the way that a theory presents the world, you're not going to be convinced by the data that we use. Obviously, if we use data convincingly, then perhaps we might have a chance of showing you that our ontology is actually useful, a way of thinking about the world. But I think ultimately, we can't just resolve this question by looking at the data, not on its own anyway.
I have a question for Helen. You commented when you mentioned the post-truth society, you said that we're allegedly in. So I'm interested in your views on whether you think we are in that state of affairs and how your answer to that question impacts on how you think we continue to insert expertise into policy making from the perspective of scholarship on that question.
Thanks, Kath, for the question. It is something I've been pondering. I was at another conference last week hosted by ANU where this was one of the things that, the conference was actually had as post-truth as part of its title, and a number of commentators questioned this. And I think my position is that we are in danger of accepting this idea of post-truth without question, without challenging it. It's one of those things where if you say something enough times, it suddenly becomes the way things are. And I think that's very dangerous, both in terms of playing into an agenda held by people who really do want to minimize the contribution of expertise to policy. But it also runs the risk of us just being completely defeatist. But I'm certainly not sanguine about the challenge. However, I'm very conscious that there are some particularly nasty features of our current popular discourse that don't appeal to any kind of evidence. So I'm skeptical, but I think that there's still space for making an impact, and it's our responsibility to do that. And I think where that leads me is to, and you'd expect me to say this as the head of an applied public policy school, is I think that academics need to be much more engaged, much more actively, and much more persistently with policymakers, both calling them out when they think that they are behaving in a way that is certainly outside of the evidence, but also engaging with them to ensure that we, as far as possible, can rely on the data that we're being presented with when we are presented with it. So I'm skeptical, but I think for me it's more of a desire to for us to do our jobs better, and that's both in conferences like this, but I guess more importantly how we engage with people who make the decisions that we all then have to live with.
My question is that World Bank giving grants to the developing countries for different programs, but that grant is on the condition of the World Bank. How civil servants can acclimatize those grants and programs according to the nation? Because grants are from the World Bank, then how can we change the attitude? Because civil servants are the national value and national administrative culture.
This is actually a very relevant question about what kind of data can we actually use for testing whether things are working or not. You have to understand that when we're talking about grand global challenges and the kind of new architectures, these are actually very, very broad issues. So we need to kind of devise some kind of very specific kind of narrowing down the topic where data actually makes sense, and then build up our findings from there upwards to the broader picture. So in the area of medical, science, one way of going through it is actually to take the data sets about projects, medical projects, and then look at basically and compare them to some kind of control groups to see whether those projects that are delivered and managed through this kind of, product development partnerships, which are very ambitious kind of, ideas, whether they are actually providing better solutions or even some answers than those that are actually not, much more in a conventional proprietary, kind of private based or entirely public. So, there are ways to go about. It requires a kind of complex research design and having very clear ideas on how to build those findings up to the kind of, more the broad kind of political or policy analysis perspective that we're actually building up. But it's actually a highly relevant question. I also feel tempted to answer the question about the post-truth society or the issues there, because I think it is actually very important. I think the populisms that we are experiencing in some parts of the world right now, particularly in Europe and the US, I think they are very paradoxical. And they're very paradoxical because they promise, on the one hand, to deliver solutions, what people want and what people need. And that is actually perfectly, absolutely important. But they promise to do that, tying your hand back and say, well, I'm going to do that on the basis of, well, not expertise, not knowledge, but ignorance, right? And so there is actually the impossibility of doing things. So my hope is that, first of all, that we as a community of knowledge people, we actually engage much more actively. And it's not easy to reach out because we tend to read each other's work, but it's very difficult to reach out. The other thing is basically to somehow pinpoint the times where decisions are made not on the basis of evidence, and then pinpoint the failures of those as well. Because I think that, there has to be someone to say, well, that decision was made without any kind of whatsoever evidence. Now, we know that evidence is not always 100% sure, but at least there's a statistical significance of what we are trying to do has some kind of proof. But the other way, doing it without that evidence, is there no whatsoever anything to be based on. And in a way, I think it's also our role to be active and critical about those decisions that have been made without a real kind of evidence base of any kind.
National administrations can be excellent and can have a great ability to manage affairs for the nation state or that they represent. The same is not necessarily true for these same administrations when it comes to their ability to act internationally. And that apart from developing the administration's capacity to handle domestic problems and domestic issues, it's essential that national civil servants become equally good at handling international affairs in their area. If these skills are not developed and are not given adequate attention in national administrations, it will limit the ability of the state to influence and help develop global public goods, like actions on climate change, like actions on migration, like international agreed policies on population growth and other aspects. And it will hinder the state in its ability to benefit from the kind of programs and support that international financial institutions and regional development banks can offer. The ability of national administrations to effectively engage with organizations such as mine determines the amount of benefit that that national administration and that country will get out of its partnership with the international organization and its ability to draw benefits from that, not only financially, but also in terms of the knowledge that can be extracted from organizations such as my own and others. So the fact that we are now starting to understand better what national officials would like to get from international cooperation and what kind of skills and abilities they would like to see developed on our side does not answer yet the question what it is that national administrations have to develop in terms of skill set and capacity to be able to draw their own benefits from engaging with an international context and for influencing the definition of global public policies that are needed to confront global issues. On the issue of data sets, I think one of the big issues that we are facing and have been facing is that there are very limited data sets and there's very limited data available on the way national civil servants interact in a globalized context. Now, the data sets that are coming out of the data Consortium, for instance, and that will come up for a second round in 2018 probably, will start giving us an idea of how in each public policy area, including in the health sector, that engagement between national officials and global health organizations, for instance, is being shaped. But these are time series that need to be developed and that can then be used to develop our understanding of how one can be more effective and how systems can be more effective in contributing to global health policies and global health solutions, and how states can be better and national officials can get better at influencing the design of those programs.
One of the questions was, how can cities effectively form and implement policies, and how can they do so without the support from the central government?
I mean, I could say more about why cities, but I think I've said enough, and there's plenty of data out there, plenty of evidence out there for people who need to still be persuaded about the significance of cities, and go to the UN. It's a great source of data on this. The question about cities and forming policy outside of central government support, I'm not quite sure what's behind the question, but I guess I'd respond in a couple of ways. Firstly, cities do this all the time. There's a range of international networks that allow cities, encourage cities, have been set up by different cities to engage together to think about innovation and policy making. So this is not new. The extent to which it's effective, I think, is debatable, but that's the same about, you can say that about any kind of public policy. The question about without central government support, though, is intriguing, because I'm not sure if what you mean by that is doing it outside of the central government resource base, for example, which I would argue in many, many countries there are examples of central governments of various forms devolving responsibility for all sorts of things to the lowest possible level without supplying sufficient resources to deliver them. So I think, again, there's some quite telling examples of how that's happening already. But if by that you meant without government support in the sense of doing something in defiance of government, then that is a much more challenging question to answer. And the closest I would get to anything approaching a satisfactory answer to that, because I think it's a compelling question, is the movement that you're seeing now in some countries to do deals between central government and major cities, so that certain things get delivered, but then there is a reasonable amount of autonomy for other things to happen that perhaps don't need reference back to central government. And again, that's not new. It's been going on in different ways for a long time, but it seems to be seeing something of a resurgence. But there's no question that it's challenging for anybody to think about how you might evolve cities as a set of institutions that perhaps become more significant than the nation state. And that really would be a question worth exploring.
Also, one of the questions came up was why should we actually focus on the cities? And I realized that has been already discussed, but somebody wanted further explanations of why is it so important. And I believe that was directed at Dr. Sullivan. There was a couple of tweets about gender equality, and people are quite happy with the composition of the panel and also with the attendance. So I thought it was important to highlight this gender equality. And the last question that came through literally 2 minutes ago was how do you square the notion of the state preparedness to the global one with a constructivist approach to defining globalization?
Yeah, how do I square a constructivist approach to in general, and to globalization with thinking about state preparedness for this? Well, I think the two can be squared without too much difficulty, in the sense that, for me, globalization, to have an impact upon states or indeed upon businesses or economic actors, that it has to be perceived and channeled into preferences and channeled into the definition of problems, public problems, or the problems for individual businesses. So all this involves human action, of course, discourse and exchange and so forth. And this is particularly the case for states, because states are structured in certain ways that are heralded from the past, but they're also structured partly to react to the problems that the hierarchies of the state perceive are there. And if the hierarchies of the state perceive globalization to be a challenge to which the state should respond, then I think research should be looking at what actually happens with these definitions of the problems, looking at questions such as Tony's question about how they train their personnel, how the personnel then is encouraged to work with actors from civil society, from business, and so forth. So I think, to sum it up, I think there is very much a relationship to be examined between, let's call it, state preparedness and the way one perceives, the way different actors perceive a globalized world.
Why is it that in a room filled with so many experts and a world filled with so many experts, none of us are elected to the highest positions in our country to be experts in policy or in evidence-based thinking? Why is it that we allow the tail to wag the dog constantly, and that we allow politicians who are often unscrupulous, maybe, but wise enough to get elected, they surround themselves with experts that they then ignore, and we elect representatives who do the same thing? When are we going to take the next step, which is to actually take control of leadership in the countries that we see desperately needing expertise? That's my question, comment, whatever. Maybe people can think about it all day or all year or whatever, but it just seems to me that we're good at getting together and identifying the problem, but not so good at actually solving it.
Just to follow up the discussions on the cities, on the Twitter that we just discussed, how the empowerments of cities for state capacity in this globalized world affected by the decentralizations and domestic government structures, mostly in, for instance, in East Asia, in Indonesia's case, for instance, that we prefer not to fully decentralize cities and its power. And then just one more question to Tony on the civil servants' capacity and the top-down policies, political policies. I mean, I'm a civil servant and state apparatus myself. I have an assumption that as a state apparatus is doing the practical thing, we need also to deal with the top-down political policies. And somehow our capacity as a state apparatus is really being affected by legislation, for instance, or by other political power that is surrounding the state apparatus. How do you point of view on that? Thank you.
It occurred to me throughout them that there was a theme emerging in which public policy and policy studies are very much in tension between being static and assured. We really know what we know. and being dynamic and diverse. And so, and I should say I'm Sarah Bice from Melbourne School of Government, and I feel like there's a bit of a charge for everyone in the room in this question, and so I put it to all of us as well as to the panel. How are we going to shake it up?
I mean, obviously civil servants act in a political context and are driven by the political priorities that are set in a given country. But civil servants also influence at the same time these policies in most contexts, maybe not in all. If a state decides it wants to contribute and participate in developing solutions to global problems, and not all states take that attitude, not all states are interested in that kind of participation, but most states tend to be part of these processes, then that's a political decision. Now, how then the officials that need to do the work to define the state's position and effectively help represent the state's position in interactions with global actors, how these officials are equipped and prepared for playing that role effectively is both a matter of the civil service as a self-governing institution and a matter for politicians as those that set priorities for the development of civil service systems. So the question of capacity and setting priorities for civil service capacity is a matter both for the self-governing body that the civil service is and for the politicians that set those strategic directions for civil service development. So the question on tweaking that capacity and those directions in a way that it's more accommodating of the needs that come with international interaction, if that's set as a priority, is something that both sets of actors need to both internalize and act upon. And one of the points that I keep making is that at this point in time, that's neither happening in even EU countries, nor in many countries that could benefit more from international engagement if they took that decision to devote more attention to that.
Well, I think that, this is actually the things that we're thinking, and we're talking around in schools of government all the time. There are two things, basically. You can actually have two big attitudes. One is, well, don't worry, things will go over, it's just a matter of short time, things will get to normal back again. And then the other one is actually much more proactive. And I'm much more tendent to the second one, to be more active. And I would say basically three items, perhaps three things we can actually do. One is to engage. I think that we live in an academic world, most of us, they want people from academia, and we like to attend big conferences and talk to each other, and we understand each other, so it's kind of comfortable. So it's kind of, we need to engage and get out of our comfort zone. And here I will appeal to some of the sociologists that they were saying, well, when you develop some networks, the strength of your network is really all about all the weak ties that you have. So the strength of weak ties. So here we need to engage, developing further our networks outside our comfort zone and developing those weak ties to people, to communities that we normally don't communicate with. So that will be one thing. The other one is educating. We have the privilege to be sitting in front of the young generation that will be the future of our countries, our cities, our regions, whatever. And I think we have a duty there to not only to teach them theories, but also to teach them kind of, what is actually their role in society and their role in the future world. So I think that, we should not underestimate the power of the next generation. And the third one will be to kind of, get there and get, kind of mud in our shoes and visit the places that we don't normally visit, and and talk to this kind of more action-oriented people on the ground doing the things. And I think that is actually more kind of this kind of more action-oriented or action-purposeful type of research that we perhaps need to get much more active. So what we are publishing is not to get published in prestigious journals, but to provide something, some evidence, some real data that actually can provide some kind of outcome for someone with a very specific purpose in mind.
Were you suggesting that maybe we should stand for election ourselves? I'd vote for you. I think your question links really nicely to Sarah's, but I think the challenge back is that we consider ourselves experts, and we engage with other people who also consider themselves experts. But just pick up on Sarah's point about shaking it up. I think we are in danger of very often only speaking to ourselves. And so while I have an awful lot of sympathy with your position that, we know that politicians make bad decisions, and we know that they don't take account of the evidence, and we know that they engage experts and then don't listen to them. I recognize all of that, but I also think that we have too often responded to that by simply saying, it's the politicians' problem. It's not our problem. We're fine. And we retreat into a kind of splendid isolation, which we're encouraged to do now because we're governed by so many metrics and measures and, ways in which if you're a young scholar you have to prove that you are an expert, that you are absolutely encouraged to not really try and connect with politicians or with policymakers because you're too busy publishing journal articles in journals that 5 other people read and, climbing up the pole. So I think there's a real tension, and if we want to shake it up, I think firstly we have to recognize that our sense of ourselves as experts is being challenged, and quite rightly so. Secondly, that people are doing things outside of formal politics and formal policy making in a way that is making a difference to their lives. And, it's not about us shaking it up. Things are being shaken up for us. We're behind the curve, to use an awful expression, in this. And so then what do? How do we manage that divide that you've both talked about? And I don't know what the answer to that is, except I think we need to raise it as a question. And we need to ask ourselves why it is that people who are policy experts don't run for office, and we need to think hard about that. And then we also do Sarah didn't mention this, but Sarah leads an extraordinary laboratory of people who are engaging in an entirely different way in thinking about public policy research that does start from a position of answering questions that other people want answered and engaging with people in terms that they define, and coming up with some quite remarkable findings as a result. Now that requires us to share our sense of ownership about expertise, and it also requires us to say that maybe in every occasion the journal article is not going to be the thing that is the most important thing, and that's a challenge for us. But I think that's the way to go. And just to respond to the point about decentralization in cities, I think one of the fundamental problems for many places is that constitutionally governance is confined to the center and the state, and it doesn't go down to the local level. And so too often what you have is administrations where the right to exist of a particular level of government is entirely at the whim of who is in power nationally at any given time. And I think until you change some of those things, it becomes harder for people to have faith that decentralized systems can work effectively. The reverse argument, of course, is that decentralized systems need to prove themselves, but the problem with that is you always find that the way of proving yourself is just that little bit further than everything you've already done. So I think there are real important questions there about power and how we constitute power in a formal way.
Who would vote for us? We're unelectable. But there is some hope there. I don't know if you know, but the leader of the Wallon Regional Council in Belgium, who led the charge against the TAFTA, is a political scientist, anyway, Paul Magnette. Second point, in France at least, we as researchers, we reject the term experts. I think it's useful to consider that we're not experts in the way that people who work, I don't know, for lobby groups or charities or whatever. Maybe they are experts, but we're researchers. We produce research. We're academics. I think we need to resuscitate. We need to breathe new life into that, to revitalize that term. Why not the term intellectual? I know there's a lot of resistance to that term. But I think part of the resistance comes from the media and the way the media is structured. And just very briefly, but my experience in France and the UK, where recently I have tried to do other things than publish journal articles, the UK is pretty impenetrable. There's no national newspapers in the UK now that take pieces from academics. There's none. In France, luckily we have Le Monde, Libération. There's a couple that will actually take them, but this is all part of the mix. We need to be analysing that too.
If I remember correctly, the whole quote of Michael Gove, when he said people are tired of experts, was something like, people are tired of experts working for organizations with acronyms that consistently get it wrong. I can't remember if he mentioned the economic crisis or not. But related to that, is that mistrust of experts getting it consistently wrong justified? I don't think it is, but it's an interesting question, I think. And secondly, in relation to that, how can we make it okay to be wrong?
And I have one concluding question. If we are in a globalized world, has public policy as a field of scholarship, has the study of public administration kept up with globalization in terms of its concepts, methods and approaches, or is it still stuck in last century?
Well, just for that question, I think, well, yeah, we should be encouraging experts to debate each other in the public sphere and say, no expert has the universal truth. And vive le débat, you could say, long live the debate. So we should be encouraging structures where that can take place, and that includes within the media, I think. And on Diane's question, I think we have the theories, the concepts on the whole. They're there. How we marshal them and we harness them to real research questions about very pertinent bodies, these international levels of governance which are insufficiently under-researched. I think that's a major new frontier for us, and how we collect and have access to data on these sort of organizations is vital.
Absolutely, we should reserve the right to be wrong. That's the only way in which anything ever gets done, is by doing it wrong and then getting it right. And quite why it now appears to be impossible for that to happen, I don't know. But it is a real constraint in government. I mean, public servants are told that they need to innovate at the same time as they're told innovate, but for goodness sake, don't get it wrong. So it's a perennial dilemma, but certainly one that is worth us pushing back at. I'm less sanguine than you about the state of public administration. I think that public administration has gone into something of a sort of self-obsession with refining certain things, and has really got a bit left behind. And my answer to that is not that we should seek to reify the global, which I know isn't what you were saying, but it's one of the risks that we run. But it's much more to look at those disciplines that are really engaging with the questions that are our questions. The disciplines like critical geography. They're having all sorts of amazing debates and discussions about the nature of cities, apart from anything else. And why is it that we've ceded that ground to other groups? I think and that's something that a public policy conference should really be able to embrace.
Yes, I mean, just two very interesting last questions. About the reserve the right to be wrong, yes, I agree with Helen's answers and the other answers. But I mean, I would also put it another way around. I mean, we believe in innovative government and, government and governance providing new innovative solutions. Then we have to be less risk averse, right? We have to get politicians and policy makers to be less risk averse. But being less risk averse does not mean that we should ignore the evidence that is out there. So, because evidence is not 100% providing super kind of clear kind of direction. Sometimes it gives an approximate solution, an approximate way, but it's better to do it that way, to use evidence, than not to use it, right? Because that will actually increase the ratio of the chances of failure much higher, right? So less risk averse, but do it on the basis of evidence. That would be my answer. And the answer to Diane, very relevant question. Are we in public policy and public administration studies becoming far too kind of, not really up to the task in the globalization? Well, yes and no. In some places it is the case that we're still kind of, stuck into this national perspective. But I would kind of like to do some kind of a little bit of advertisement from Copenhagen Business School. We have a Master of Sciences in International Business and Politics. International Business and Politics. Why is that? Because we believe that the next generation of our students, the next generation of experts in our field, will be people who will be able to move from the national to the international level in their career, but also be able to move from the public sector to the private sector and back again, all through their career. So we are preparing them for doing this kind of two types of movement, and we are kind of providing them with international business, but also international politics perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not from an academic institution, so whenever we get things wrong, usually the world punishes us for it. At least global public opinion does. So that, of course, leads in my institution to a certain degree of risk aversion. That's very unfortunate in many ways, but getting things wrong is not something that we can afford to do very often in international organizations, and that makes us different from academic institutions that have more leeway in that regard, I think. In terms of the state of play of a discipline of public policy and public administration, I mean, there are areas where I think much more needs to be done. I mean, the point that the issue that I've been talking about of why is it that in the private sector there is so much more internationalization in management of private sector organizations, regardless on where they're based. And why is that not possible in national systems? It's, I think, a question that is worth debating. When it comes to being behind or in front of the curve, I think there are a lot of interesting elements of research that are coming out of countries like India and Pakistan, Malaysia, Korea, that need to be much more carefully considered by the discipline of public administration that, in my view, and working for an international organization, is still very OECD driven. Even in my institution, we are too much OECD driven. While the innovations come from Pakistan, Punjab, or Madhya Pradesh in India, when it comes to issues of how do you get around stuck systems to deliver services for citizens. There are a lot of innovative solutions that have been developed in areas and in parts of the world that don't get much recognition. We've tried to bring that out through some of the publications that we have done in the World Bank, but I don't know why the academic discipline is not picking those up. When I went to the program here, I see very little reflection of the Korean experience with e-government, the South Asian experiments with using ICT to change the way citizens dialogue with government and give feedback on public policies and their implementation, or other examples like that. And I think the discipline could do a lot more with what's coming out and the learning that comes out of contexts like South Asia and Southeast Asia, and that really have a lot of new insights to offer, but don't get picked up enough in my view.